Hey everyone, so I wanted to count down, rank the Neil Young studio records. It's hard to think of an artist in the last 5 years, especially pandemic on, that has been as active as Neil Young. Now you can say, well, he hasn't been in the charts, or what do you mean, hasn't a hit in years and all that stuff, but he's put out more archival records and even studio records, films. His archive site is amazing, Neil Young Archives. Just constant treasure trove of material. He's put out bootleg albums. It is hard to keep up, but Neil has been a constant in my life because of this, more so in the last 5 years, 10 years really. Ever since I moved out west, Neil Young has sort of, especially to Northern California, it worked for me in the 90s, Neil Young a lot, and then I kind of stopped listening. I always kept up, but I didn't listen obsessively or anything. And then when I moved to Northern California, it just clicked. Driving along the coast and the redwood trees and knowing that Neil's from there, it just made sense. And it's also around the time I bought my nice turntable, and it really upgraded from the cheap one I bought in the 90s when I first got back into vinyl. And the first record I ever played was Zuma, between two speakers up really close to my San Francisco apartment. There wasn't much room, but it was kind of the perfect setup though. It was like right close to both speakers, but enough room is like the perfect triangle. And I did a side-by-side comparison of Zuma on vinyl and Zuma on CD, and I was floored, especially when it came to Danger Bird. And that in some ways was responsible for me starting to buy vinyl again and eventually stop buying CDs and go vinyl only as far as physical media. But so I decided, not only did he kind of kickstart that for me, I've been into him since I really got into him when I was about 20, I think, when Harvest Moon came out. And in college earlier than that too. I had probably Harvest, After the Gold Rush, Rust Never Sleeps. I think those were the three I had. Decade. I think I had Decade too. But Neil Young became much more of a current thing when he toured with Sonic Youth and Nirvana, Weld, Ragged Glory, that whole period. And then Harvest Moon blew me away when it came out. A lot of people don't think about that record so much anymore, but it was huge, and it sounded great. I absolutely loved it. It made me a fan. And I saw him on tour with Booker T and the MGs shortly after that, and I've been following him ever since. But yeah, like I was saying earlier, Neil Young in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, especially with the archives, has been such a constant. He feels like my Uncle Neil or something. He's always putting something out. You can go really get lost in his archives and listening to songs that never were officially released, live albums, studio albums, and like insane quality. Yeah, all of that stuff. So I thought it would be good to count down Neil's records. A lot of times I see like the top 10 Neil Young, the top 15. I want to do them all. I think in some ways the ones that are less popular are more interesting to talk about, although I'm sure my fandom is going to kick in a lot more when we get towards the records that made me a huge fan and the records that I keep coming back to. I was surprised. Now there's 43 records I'm going to rank. I was surprised to see some of these records show up. Some of them that I thought would be number 43, 42 are actually probably in the low 30s now. I originally made a list, and then I focused on like the bottom 10 and listened to them all, and then kind of figured out this list from there. I'm going to do, I believe, 8 today, and then have other videos with this. But yeah, my rule was if I hadn't listened to it in the last 6 months, 7 months, a year, maybe tops, I had to listen to it again. And I think in most cases I'm going to listen to everything again. But I definitely did that with the records we're going to go over today. Some of them I hadn't heard in years, and that explains in some ways why they moved around a lot more than I would have thought they would before I listened to them and started doing this. So I have to start somewhere with a Neil Young record, and actually number 43 and 42 are sort of interchangeable. Right until I hit record just now, I was kind of second guessing myself which one actually is going to be 43 and which one's going to be 42. But have to start somewhere, have to pick one. For me, it's this album that came out in 1986, I believe. No, 87. 87 by Neil Young and Crazy Horse, and it's called Life. If you look at the cover, now a lot of this stuff, I hadn't heard this album, I think, much at all until maybe the last like 4 years, maybe I got it 4 years ago. It still does very, very little for me. But I do think it's great. The more you look at this cover, you know, he's behind bars. He was really feeling trapped by his David Geffen Company contract. I mean, they actually sued him for not sounding Neil Young enough, which is just crazy. They lost. But here he is counting down the records. This is a 5th record with Geffen, the last one, like a life sentence, and then he's done. And he goes back to Reprise, where he started off his career, and he still is with them today. But it just is kind of it has that production value of Landing on Water and Trans a little bit. Trying to sound modern, trying to sound, I don't know, 80s production. It's apparently recorded live. I don't think you'd ever know it, except that it's very sloppy. But I think he went back in and tweaked the tracks or something, because it just sounds so flat. I find that there's very few hooks on it at all. The songs just seem to drag on and on. There are 2 songs on it, though, that he started playing with Crazy Horse. When I saw him in 1997, I believe he did it. And he did it also on the live album, Year of the Horse. I think both of these are on it. Prisoners of Rock and Roll and When Your Lonely Heart Breaks. I especially love When Your Lonely Heart Breaks. And even on this record, I think it sounds kind of good. It's a little bit more minimal. But this is my number 43, Neil Young, Life. Getting into number 42. Now, this is probably going to piss some people off, and I'm okay with that. But number 42 for me, and a record that truly was a chore to get through, is Americana. I just don't like this record. I find that a lot of Neil Young's genre exercises just don't work. Some of them do. Some are fascinating. A lot of them seem to come about when he's in some kind of turmoil and it gets released instead of the album he was working on. There's kind of that story going on here. Now, I don't know if that's going on with Americana. My understanding of Americana is he was recording Psychedelic Pill with Crazy Horse. He had this album of new material, but he wanted to warm them up. The Horse was back, and he wanted to warm them up, and they did it by covering all these folk standards. Oh, Susanna, Clementine, Wayfaring Stranger, Jesus Chariot. I mean, all these songs that are Gallows Pole, you would think would be great. Like, I like a lot of this material. I like it when Dylan sings some of these songs, or, you know, other folk artists. I just don't like what Neil does here. It sounds very, very sloppy. He's bringing in lyrics that haven't been used in a while with a lot of these songs, but it kind of makes them not as catchy or memorable and super long. The only redeeming thing I thought when I first heard this, and I'm like, oh man, you know, MP3 era, I think I downloaded it or streamed it, and I was listening to it, and the only redeeming thing I thought was the last song's called God Save the Queen. I thought that was going to be the Sex Pistols version. No. It's a classic, God Save the Queen. So yeah, that's my number 42. Interesting story. I had somebody who wanted to buy that record for me a couple times and like insisted, like, well, let me buy it for you. And I was like, no, I don't want. I just don't like it. I don't like that record. I mean, now, sure, I kind of wish I had it now, but just to have it, just because I've got most of the other Neil Young stuff, not because I would really put it on very much at all. So number 41 for me. Now, this might surprise some people too. I think a lot of people would think that this would be a lot higher, you know, as far as good albums go, than like the third worst in my mind at number 41, and that is Hawks and Doves. It just doesn't work for me either, and I think a lot of it is because it's sort of patchy. You got one side that apparently was kind of leftovers from different sessions, and some of those songs actually show up on albums that he's put out recently, of albums that never came out. The story of Neil is kind of complicated that way. He would sometimes record a whole album, decide to pull it the last minute, use some of the songs on an album that came out a couple years later, and that was the case with Hawks and Doves. So the more acoustic side is, I think it's the Dove side, apparently, is more like mellow. But it just doesn't really catch fire for me. I mean, there's some good songs on there, Captain Kennedy, Little Wing, but it just seems inessential, and there's something missing. I cannot really put my finger on it, but there's something missing. Now, the second side, the Hawk side, if I'm reading this right, is very much new at the time, and it's I find it really annoying, to be honest. Especially, the material's kind of not memorable to me. Staying power, coastline, coming apart at every nail. But it's the Union Man and the coming apart at every nail that just drives me crazy. And I had a really hard time with this one too. Listening to it all the way through, I just kind of wanted to pick up the needle and go, okay, cool, I listened to it, because he's like just this Union Man and stuff. And it seems like the pro-Reagan is a time when he came out, sort of shocked everybody, supporting Reagan. And I don't know, it doesn't work for me at all. And I think the best songs have been picked for records that he's since put out. But yeah, that's Hawks and Doves, number 41. Now, number 40 is, sorry, I'm losing my notes here. Number 40 is an album that he did by Promise of the Real. And you would think, they're a great band. Like, I saw them live with Neil, and it was an incredible show. I think it was on the Monsanto Years tour. And, I mean, it sounded like Crazy Horse or something. Just a really powerful band that could just totally rock out. And it's just a shame to me that he didn't have better material when it came to studio records with them. And the one for me that comes in at number 40 is called The Visitor. I like the cover. I was like, oh, that looks really cool. It looks like a classic Neil Young album. The single that came out was called Children of Destiny. And oh my God, I was like, oh no, Sometimes Neil can just be so on the nose, just so literal. It's like getting a lecture on something. It's not poetic. He's not using a lot of metaphor. It's just super direct. And this, as much as I agree with his politics, this came out during the early years of the Trump administration, I just don't like it. There's very few songs in here I think he would ever probably play live now. Definitely an In the Moment album, but it wasn't there for me in the moment. It didn't do anything, and it did very little for me when I played it again. Musicianship, sure, that's great. It sounds awesome. They're a great band. But when it comes to actual songs, there's really something missing on that one, for sure. No, so number 40, or that was number 40, number 39, we're getting to the 30s now, is an album that came out when I was probably still at the height of my fandom for Neil Young as far as him currently putting out material. I mean, in the 90s, he was just on fire. Not only did he have, Ragged Glory kicked it off, which isn't one of my favorite albums. I'll get to that later. But then he did Harvest Moon and Mirror Ball and Sleeps with Angels and Broken Arrow and Silver and Gold. And then the album that came after this was called Are You Passionate? And for me, it was sort of dead on arrival when I heard the song Let's Roll. It's this song that capitalizes on 9/11. It's super direct. It just seems like a little too much. I mean, at the time, I just kind of didn't want to listen to it. I wasn't sure where he was going, or he was tying it in with a certain political view that I didn't agree with. But when it came time to listen to the actual album, I just found it really boring. I mean, it's like kind of a soul record. You've got Booker T and the MGs backing them up. The very first time I saw Neil Young, it was with Booker T and the MGs. It was after Harvest Moon. I think it was in the summer of 1993. Soundgarden opened, and so did Blind Melon. And it was a great show. Neil Young was fantastic. I loved every minute of it, and it totally rocked out too. It wasn't just like this soul review kind of thing. It sounded like Harvest Moon. It sounded like Zuma, it was rock songs and a mixture of it, and a great backing band. But with this album, it feels very much like a genre exercise. It feels underwritten, and the only real memorable bit on here is Going Home with Crazy Horse. Now, interesting backstory here, there was an album that was recorded before Are You Passionate and pulled at the last minute, or maybe not the last minute. I think it was too close for him, and he sat on the tapes, and then he redid them with Booker T and the MGs. But the original album was with Crazy Horse, and it's called Toast, and we'll get to it later in this countdown. After Are You Passionate, for me, at number 38, is another album he did with Promise of the Real. Now, some people are probably really surprised that I'm picking these Promise of the Real albums and making them like towards the end of my list. Great band. These records sound fine if you play them in the background and you're not really listening. I mean, Crazy Horses or Promise of the Real are an incredible band. When I saw them live with Neil Young in Las Vegas in 2016. It was promoting this album, the Monsanto Years. It was a phenomenal show. It was so good. It reminded me of being in the audience, like must have been in 1973 or something. The cover for Time Fades Away went through my head, and people around me, mostly older than me, baby boomers, were like, wow, I haven't seen Neil this close in years. And I scored tickets just by, I thought it was priced out, you know, it was all like reserved seating. And then I realized that there was this section called General Admission that existed for this particular show at the Chelsea in Las Vegas, and it was right up front. So yeah, and it was totally reasonable, and my God, it was a great show. But for some reason, he hasn't really been able to do the level of album he should do with Promise of the Real. I think the material is just kind of weak. It's so over the top. I mean, learn all you can about Monsanto. You will learn all you can by listening to this. Evil Corporation, don't like them. You know, I agree with Neil. You know, Rockstar Bucks a coffee shop kind of takes on Starbucks, but it's just very much like I don't know, reading a newspaper. It's not really a good record that has much staying power at all. So that's why I placed Monsanto at number 38. Number 37 is one of those Geffen records. I think a lot of people are probably wondering why there are not all Geffen records in my first installment here of the end of, you know, sort of the worst of Neil. I hate using that word. It's because I think they have more redeeming value, and they actually place a little higher for me. But number 37 is one record from the Geffen years. It was originally recorded, I guess, in 1983, and David Geffen, I think after Trans, was like, oh my God, you got to sound like Neil again, and actually took him to court and sued him for not sounding enough like Neil Young, which is completely crazy, and Neil Young did win. But this album came out of that, although it came out a couple years later, and that is Old Ways. I think it came out in 85, but he tweaked it a little bit, wrote some new songs, and apparently with his Archives project, he's going to put out the original Old Ways at some point. It's a fine album. It sounds great in the background. You could be, you know, sitting outside, you know, having the background, play it, you know, just not listening that closely. It sounds like an album from one of his guests. It sounds like a later day, you know, 1980s anyway, like Waylon Jennings or Willie Nelson record, when they weren't really, you know, back in their game, or really weren't like nailing it with good records. It sounds like a modern country record for that time, 1985. It's got those guys, Willie Nelson and Waylon, are all over it, which is great, but it just never really catches fire, and the songs just aren't very good. It's pretty underwritten. But if you listen to Neil Young and the Harvesters record, the live one that came out a little while ago, it works. It works live. It sounds pretty good. I like it much better than I do this record. Although I must say, when I first listened to this record, I was surprised that I liked it as much as I did. I thought it was just going to be one of those, you know, based on reputation, it was just horrible. I don't think it's horrible. I just think it's like a very average record doing the style that Neil Young is sort of known for, although this is definitely more traditional, you know, or not traditional, more modern country, more 80s modern country. But you would think with these guest stars that it would sound like a sequel to Harvest or Comes a Time, which I'm sure was sort of the idea at the time. But yeah, so that's number 37. The final one we're going to look at today at number 36 is another sort of genre exercise, I guess, for Neil. It's a bunch of cover songs recorded in a different way. Now, for context, this album came out around the time he was promoting Pono, which is was his version, like an MP3 player, not MP3s though, playing like lossless music, the best that digital could offer. And he was consistently ranting against any kind of digital music, just saying it just ones and zeros and analog's the way to go, except for his Pono thing. And it's just sort of ironic, and he got a lot of crap for it when he put out this album, because this album was recorded in a 1940s little booth that you would record a song and he would basically spit out or like make a record for you. And Jack White of the White Stripes has a vintage one at his record store, and Neil Young went in with a batch of cover songs and recorded them using that technique, and it sounds like it came out in the 1940s, but not in a good way. I like the idea of it, and it's cool. You know, I'm glad I have it. There are some really good songs on here. A lot of the songs are great, just the versions aren't so great. But I do think there's really good versions of Girl from the, or not Girl from the North Country. Needle of Death, I think is great. The two Gordon Lightfoot songs, Early Morning Rain and If I Could Read Your Mind, are really, really good. But he just, when he does like On the Road Again by Willie Nelson or Springsteen's My Hometown, it sounds kind of flat. It sounds under rehearsed. Kind of sounds like he just practiced these in his hotel room before, the night before, if that, and just hit record. The other thing that's kind of weird about it is he has this, he sort of he talks to his mom, like he's somehow communicating with her. She had passed away recently, and he lost his dad too. And he's sort of communicating with them or trying to through this. It's touching. It's a little surreal, but also feels a little almost too personal, like I shouldn't be listening to that, and a little goofy at the same time. That kind of opens up each side where he's talking to his mom, kind of hoping that his mom and dad can get together or talk to each other now that they're both in heaven. But as a record, I think it sounds okay. It doesn't sound okay. It's okay at times, and there is a clean version of it that you can get on his archive site where I think the sound was pumped directly, a mic directly into like probably an analog setup that wasn't using the 1940s booth setup. And again, some of this material is good, a couple songs, but I think it overstays its welcome. I think he could have done a little bit better job by selecting songs and rehearsing them a little bit more, being a little bit more careful about that. But that's where we start. So that's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 8 records. So 8 records of what I'm counting as 43 studio records. I am including some of those albums that came out more recently, but that were intended for a record. And I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but I'm not including any kind of soundtrack. I'm also not including any like companion, any album where he's like collaborating with someone like that. Long May You Run with him and Stephen Stills, or obviously any Crosby, Stills, Nash, Young, and anything like that. Anything that wasn't released under the Neil Young name and isn't a studio record, I'm not touching, because this series is already going to be long enough. But that's my rundown. Stay tuned for the next installment when I kick off, starting with number 35 on this exhaustive countdown of Neil Young's records, which is going to get more and more exciting the closer we get. There's so many albums too that just don't get the attention they deserve. We're going to get into all of that in future installments. Thank you.